below Ptolemy of the Huns, at a distance of about 3,000 stadia, there is Adulis, a port established by law, situated at the inner end of a bay that runs in toward the south. Before the harbor is the so-called mountain island, about 200 stadia seaward from the very head of the bay, with the shores of the mainland close on both sides. Ships bound for this port now anchor here. Opposite Mountain Island, on the mainland 20 stadia from shore, was Adulis, a fair-sized village, from which it was a 3-day journey to Calo, an inland town and the first market for ivory. From that place to the city of the people called Oxumites was a 5-day journey more. All the ivory was brought to that place from the country beyond the Nile through the district called Cyenium, and thence to Adulis. Before the harbor of that market town, out at sea on the right are a great many little sandy islands called Alalei. They yield tortoiseshell, which is brought to market there by the fish-eaters. Adulis is located about 30 kilometers south of the modern port of Missoua and lies near the mouth of the Gulf of Zula. J. Theodore Bent describes Adulis in the following way: Adulis was one of the colonies of Ptolemy Philadelphus and was always of commercial importance because it was the natural port for Abyssinia and the Sudan. 1.22. The decline of Aksum. Aksum's decline was partly due to coastal occupation by Muslim caliphates and Beja tribes, leading to a significant dissociation from the sea. It was also cut out from the resource-rich areas in the west due to the uprising of various Beja tribes and internal invasion by the Aga people. The collapse of Aksum in the late 1st millennium CE led to a southward shift of power, first to Lalibela under the Zagwe dynasty, 1137 to 1270, and then to Shoa with the rise of the Solomonic dynasty, which lasted until 1974. The decentralized system introduced by the latter maintained significant coastal links, with Adulis replaced by Missoua and Hirgigo as key sea outlets. The southward movement of power also connected the empire to seaports like Zila and Berbera, facilitating trade through caravan routes. The coastal polities were organized as caliphates and/or sultanates and were ideologically more closely connected with the Islamic centers in the Middle East, Trimingham 1952. The resulting isolation, completed with the spread of Islam in the coastal areas, led to shifting allegiances. This religious difference and the skewed Christian-Muslim ratio between the highlands and lowlands continues to define current politics in the region, Abing 2014. The rivalry between the various sultanates in the eastern lowlands and coastal areas and the Abyssinian state culminated in the Gran Wars, heavily influenced by Middle Eastern support for Gran and Portuguese military aid for the Abyssinian state. Following several military incursions into and invasions of extensive lands, Gran was later defeated with the help of a Portuguese expedition in 1542. Gran's Adal Sultanate gradually became weaker, which led to the establishment of Azza as a prominent Afar Sultanate. The Afar lost more area to the hegemony of the Turks as in Dalakan Zila, albeit without relinquishing day-to-day local rule until the time the Italians gained foothold in Assab, 1870s, the French in Abak, Djibouti, 1862, and the Turks in Zila. The Afar power became extremely diminished by the end of the 18th century, and they disintegrated into smaller sultanates, chiefdoms, and independent tribes. The independent Afar sultanates signed 19 agreements with various European colonial powers, copies of which are included in A. Shami's Al-Manhal, 2018, pages 512 to 663. The Gran Wars also led to the Oromo migration and the establishment of Gondar as the government's seat. Despite isolation from coastal areas, this period saw stable power consolidation, transformation of land ownership in Abyssinia, and improved coastal relations, especially with Missoua. The disruptive era of the princes followed the relative stability during Gondar's preeminence. With Djaj Qasimirich's rise as Johannes IV, the Abyssinian Empire's center briefly came close to the Red Sea. However, during the scramble for Africa, the British secretly encouraged the Italians to occupy Missoua to curb French advances, breaking promises to Johannes. The elites of Missoua, fearing Johannes' reputation as anti-Muslim, tacitly accepted Italian encroachment. Consequently, Italian expansion into Eritrea faced little resistance from communities exhausted from Abyssinian interference. When Johannes IV took power, the highlands of Eritrea were autonomous regions ruled by local families under customary laws. Rezai Woldemikael Solomon, ruler of Hamasen, 1841–1879, from Hasga replaced Rezai Halutekli Hymenot of Tsatsiga, who was appointed by Emperor Tewodros II. Ras Alula, on behalf of Emperor Johannes IV, raided and pillaged several parts of Eritrea at different times and undermined the traditional structure before and after his appointment as governor of Merab Melish, Sire, Hamas Sen, and Akal Goze, on October 9, 1876. Despite registering impressive victories against the Egyptians, Gundet, 1875, Gurai, 1876, the Mahdaists, Kufit, Kessala 1885, and the ambush of Dogali, 1887, Alula never succeeded in having complete control of Eritrea. Rezai Woldemikael, Bata Hagas, Kifleyesus and the Tigrayan renegade Dabab, with his Asawarda fighters, resisted his presence. Ehrlich 1997, 11–16, 25, 32, and was forced to withdraw his forces to join the fight against the Mahdaists where Johannes IV was killed. The Italians could control most parts of Eritrea without significant resistance, as the people were fed up with Abyssinian incursions. Johannes' death in a battle against the Sudan's Mahdaists allowed Menelik to become king of kings in Ethiopia. Menelik's rise was aided by his astute tactical maneuvers in exploiting local conditions and the rivalry among foreign powers. It was also facilitated by Johannes' isolated rule and the distance between Tigray and Shoa. When Menelik assumed power, European colonial powers were already established along the coast. Unlike Johannes, Menelik expanded southward, taking advantage of the geoclimatic barriers to fend off Europeans. Following the Battle of Adwa, 1896, he signed several treaties with the Italians, French and British that define the present national boundaries in the Horn of Africa. Contrary to the views expressed by some Ethiopian elites that Menelik signed the border treaties under duress, he had an upper hand after his victorious Battle of Adwa and willingly participated in the treaties. The three treaties signed between Eritrea's colonizer Italy and Ethiopia's Menelik in the early 1990s that established the boundaries between current Eritrea and Ethiopia. 2.0 Modern history. The modern state dynamics in the Horn of Africa, HOA, have been impacted by colonial history and post-colonial state building, shaped by the unique geoclimatic conditions. The separation of the same ethnic communities in some instances, and the merging of less related ones into single political economies in others, are key consequences of European colonialism and state-building models that followed. Colonialism also profoundly impacted the HOA by triggering the formation of independent states from existing autonomous and semi-autonomous polities and establishing new borderlands. It is the modern colonial history that shaped territorial definitions of current Eritrea and Ethiopia and thus, the relevant history for the purpose of this project. For the purpose here, modern history covers the following periods: early Italian colonization, the consolidation of Italian colonization, the British military administration in Eritrea, the federation of Eritrea with Ethiopia, and the armed struggle for the independence of Eritrea. Each period is briefly discussed in the following sections. 2.1 Early Italian colonization. The contemporary history of Eritrea traces back to the unification of various independent entities and sultanates in the area, and Italy declared it as a colony on January 1, 1890. Italy's initial move in the process of its colonization was to establish a presence in Assab, which involved three key steps. The first was, when on November 15, 1869, Giuseppe Sapato, acting on behalf of the Italian government, secured a land agreement with the local Afar, Ankala tribe, chiefs in Assab. The second step, on March 11, 1870, involved another agreement between the Italian Sordo-Rabattino Shipping Company and the chief of the Ankala Afar tribe, facilitated by the approval of Sultan Mohammed Hanfair of Azza, the Afar spiritual leader, for a bunkering station in Assab. The third step, on March 16, 1870, saw the acquisition of several islands and additional territories in the Assab area through agreements with the Afar Sultanate of Rahida, also endorsed by Sultan Hanfair. Following these agreements, the Italian shipping company transferred the lands and islands acquired in Assab and the Afar Rahida Sultanate to the Italian government on March 1882. Subsequently, Italy declared Assab a colony on July 10, 1882, culminating in the establishment of a strategic foothold in the region. Notwithstanding the expansionist Ethiopian claims over Assab and Dankalia, no Abyssinian ruler was involved in those agreements. They were between the Afar Sultanates, who had sovereignty over the land and sea, and the Italian government. 2.2 Consolidation of Italian colonialism. Abyssinia had no historical jurisdiction on Missawa and its environs either. Roughly a century after Özdemir Pasha's capture of the Missawa and Hirgigo ports in 1557, the Ottoman Empire delegated authority to a locally influential Beja-descended family, the Balaws, nominating its leader as their naib, or deputy. By the mid-1700s, these deputies had solidified their political influence, asserted their dominance, and effectively became the preeminent rulers over a broad region that spanned from the Red Sea coast to the Highland Plateau. In 1846, control of Missawa shifted to the Egyptian Khedive when the Ottoman Empire transferred its rights over the port city and its surrounding territories to Egypt. This handover included areas stretching from south of the Egyptian border to Zila, encompassing the entire western Red Sea coast and parts of the Gulf of Aden. These territories had been under the nominal control of the Ottoman Empire, with its actual presence limited to Missawa and a strategic position in Zila. Italy capitalized on Egypt's waning influence along the Red Sea coastline, attributed to its internal instability and engagements in conflicts on several fronts, including areas now known as Eritrea and Sudan. Recognizing its vulnerable state, Egypt signed a confidential agreement with Italy on January 25, 1885, consenting to evacuate Bailul, where it had military presence. This agreement enabled Italy to rapidly occupy Bailul and other coastal villages up to Missawa, receiving a warm reception from local tribal leaders following directives from Sultan Mohammed Hanfair. This sequence of events led to Italy's successful occupation of Missawa by February 1885. Until the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire maintained a superficial control over the western coast of the Red Sea. This period saw the region destabilized by several factors: the rise of the Mahdiist movement in Sudan, 1881-98, conflict between Ethiopia's Emperor Yohannes IV and the Mahdiysts, internal disputes within Tigray and the Eritrean highlands, and the rivalry between Menelik II, the ruler of Shoa, and Emperor Yohannes IV. For the Italians, expanding their territory north and south of Missawa into areas predominantly Muslim, proved more straightforward than their efforts to conquer the central highlands, Kabisa, comprised of Akele Goze, Hamaseen, and Siri, because people in the lowlands were fed up with Abyssinian and Sudanese incursions. Historically and functionally, the highlands were more integrated into the fabric of the Abyssinian Empire. The campaign to assert control over this region demanded significantly more resources, power, and effort than previous Italian endeavors to secure the stretch from the Rahida Sultanate's border to Missawa and its adjacent plains. Once Italy expanded its control from Assab and its environs to the Missawa region, and eventually to the highland, Kabisa, areas, it consolidated its colonization of Eritrea, which lasted for over 60 years. Over those years, Italian colonialism had a substantial socio-political impact. Most significantly, it brought together disparate communities under one rule and territory that shared a common experience and was the main catalyst for the development of Eritrean nationalism. 2.3 The British military administration. After the defeat of Italy in World War II in 1941, the British came to control Eritrea in the name of trusteeship under the rule of the British Military Administration, BMA. Eritrean intellectuals at that time started to engage in politics, Taking advantage of the political atmosphere created by the BMA. They met regularly to discuss the future of the country in 1941 and formed the patriotic society known as Society for the Love of the Country, SLC, Maber Fikri Hager Eritrea Integrinya, or Jemiyat Hub al-Watan in Arabic. When the British administration opened the political space in 1946, Eritreans took the opportunity to form about 10 political parties. Of those parties, the most important and influential were the Eritrean Muslim League, EML, the Eritrean Liberal Progressive Party, ELPP, and the Unionist Party, UP. The political parties developed into two main blocks. One bloc, that called for the independence of Eritrea, was mainly comprised of the EML, headed by Ibrahim Sultan, and the ELPP, headed by Risi Tessima Asparam. The other bloc, led by the UP initially headed by Tidlaberu, called for Eritrea's unity with Ethiopia and was fully supported by the latter. Thus, the Eritrean struggle for self-determination and independence started effectively in the 1940s. Combined with Ethiopian quest for ownership of the Red Sea, geopolitical interest of global powers, the division and infighting among Eritreans and their failure to reach consensus on the future of their country contributed to the Eritrean question becoming internationalized and discussed in the United Nations. The external actors failed to reach any consensus on how to dispose Eritrea due to their divergent interests. Nevertheless, Eritreans showed unity in aborting the cynical British attempt to partition Eritrea between Sudan and Ethiopia, supported by the US and accepted by Ethiopia. A compromise solution was reached at the United Nations to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia in 1950. 2.4. The Federation of Eritrea with Ethiopia. The Eritrea-Ethiopia Federation, the first of its kind in Africa, was a compromise to the internal Eritrean division between those who wanted independence and those who wanted unity with Ethiopia. It was also a compromise for the world powers between those who favored Eritrea's independence and those who wanted to unite Eritrea to Ethiopia. Access to the Red Sea sought by Ethiopia was one of the central points in the discussions and political maneuvers. Following the Federal Act, the Eritrean parties favoring independence accepted it as a compromise and the independence bloc was changed to the Democratic Front to safeguard it. However, the federation was born lame and became an easy prey for Ethiopia's expansionist desires, which coincided with the superpowers' interests and intrigues. Nevertheless, the federal arrangement provided Eritrea with a democratic constitution, a legislative body, the National Assembly, with broad democratic rights, including the provision to hold elections of its members. It also provided Eritrea with its own flag, coat of arms and official seals. Such provisions conflicted with Ethiopia's imperial rule, and Ethiopia's reformative constitution of 1955 undermined the federal arrangement. Ethiopia gradually dismantled the Eritrean institutional provisions one by one and illegally annexed Eritrea, declaring it a province of Ethiopia, while the prominent world powers and the UN itself turned a blind eye to this development. 2.5. The armed struggle and independence of Eritrea. Eritreans, having exhausted all available peaceful means to restore their rights, resorted to armed struggle in 1961, fought for over 30 years, culminating in the liberation of Eritrea in 1991. Eritrean independence was legalized by holding a referendum, organized with the support of the UN in April 1993, in which Eritreans voted overwhelmingly for independence, resulting in recognition by Ethiopia itself and other countries. Thus, Eritrea became an independent, sovereign member state of the World Community of Nations on May 28, 1993. Ethiopia enjoyed direct access to the Red Sea as the Federation member, 1952 to 1962, and by illegally occupying Eritrea, 1962 to 1991. During the latter period, the region was embroiled in the expensive Eritrean War of Liberation. Even after its independence, Eritrea had allowed Ethiopia free access to the Red Sea via Asab and Massawa until 1998, when a border dispute broke, and Ethiopia boycotted the ports, thinking the action would hurt Eritrea more than it would Ethiopia. The initial border dispute escalated into a full-blown armed conflict from 1998 to 2000, ending up with the Algiers Agreement that established the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission, EEBC. The Commission rendered its decision on the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia in April 2002. The Commission's decision, stipulated to be final and binding by the Algiers Agreement, reaffirmed Eritrea's borders and territories that included the Red Sea coastal areas, including Massawa, Assab, and its islands. Ethiopia, although hesitantly accepted the Commission's decision, it showed reluctance 2 years later to implement the decision by employing various delaying tactics, forcing the EEBC to demarcate the boundaries only virtually and close its office. This led to a prolonged period of tension that lasted until Ethiopia's new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, assumed power in 2018. Unlike Ethiopia's prevarications over the Algiers Agreement, Eritrea accepted the Commission's decision despite its displeasure with certain aspects of the outcome. When Abiy Ahmed came to power in Ethiopia, his acceptance of the Algiers Agreement was one of the developments that enabled his rapprochement with Eritrea and his award of the Nobel Peace Prize, only to renege 5 years later demanding ownership of and access to the Red Sea in the manner he did. 3.0. Summary and conclusion. Eritrea, situated in the Horn of Africa, and comprised of 9 ethnic groups, is of substantial cultural and historical importance. It shares significant ancient history with neighboring communities in the area. Excavations have uncovered Eritrea's function as a commerce nexus from 2300 BCE, connecting the Nile Valley and the Ethiopian highlands during pre-Aksumite era. Preliminary urban settlements, called Ona, along with agro-pastoral communities next to Asmara, established the region's urbanization foundation. The Aksumite kingdom flourished between approximately 50 BCE to 700 CE. It encompassed considerable portions of current Eritrea and Tigray and was a significant trade ally of Rome and Byzantium. The historic port of Adulis linked the Aksumite and Roman empires. The purpose of covering ancient history here is to merely indicate that people in the territory now comprising current Eritrea do share a common history and culture with the other communities in the region, as is true with several countries in Africa. However, it is the modern history, especially the advent of European colonialism, which shaped the current state borders, that is most relevant for the purpose here. Eritrea was established as an Italian colony in 1890 following accords with local Afar chieftains. A series of agreements between colonial Italy and Ethiopia established the currently recognized borders between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Following Italy's defeat in 1941, Eritrean intellectuals established political parties under the British rule, promoting either independence or unification with Ethiopia. The 1950 UN Declaration of Federation with Ethiopia led to the eventual absorption of Eritrea by Ethiopia. Following Ethiopia's dissolution of the federation and annexation of Eritrea, Eritreans commenced an armed campaign in 1961, which resulted in de facto independence in 1991. A vote in a referendum held in 1993 formalized its independence, and Eritrea became a member of the United Nations as an independent sovereign state on May 28, 1993. A border conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia from 1998 to 2000 led to the Algiers Agreement, which affirmed the colonially established borders between the two countries. Ethiopia experienced economic growth from 1998 to 2018 despite losing access to Eritrean ports. After a brief mending of relations between the two countries when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, Ethiopia's quest for Red Sea access and claims on Eritrea have strongly resurfaced, adversely impacting the relations between the two countries and the peace of the region. References